Considering the rapid advancements of artificial intelligence in the past few years and the recent rise of cutting-edge companies like Chat GPT and OpenAI, many of the cautionary themes and motifs from Steven Spielberg's 2001 movie, AI: Artificial Intelligence, are starting to come to fruition. Of course, it's no mystery that perhaps the greatest cinematic visionary in history, Stanley Kubrick, developed the film for many years before handpicking Spielberg to realize the dark fairy tale that follows David, a young artificial mecha who wants nothing more than to be loved by his human mother as much as he's been programmed to love her. Always ahead of the curve, Kubrick's prescience of the potential benefits and dangers of AI in this project dates back to the 1970s. This begs the question, why the hell did AI take so long to get produced? One reason is that Kubrick felt the visual effects and CGI needed to accurately represent artificially intelligent characters were simply not advanced enough in the 70s and 80s. But really, that's just scratching the surface, as a lot more went into the production that lasted nearly 30 years before Spielberg did his best to honor Kubrick's uncompromising vision. Stay tuned. From this development to its pre-release impact, we are about to find out what the f*** happened to AI, artificial intelligence. Stanley Kubrick began working on AI in the 1970s after purchasing rights to Brian Aldiss's 1969 short sci-fi story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long. Kubrick hired Aldiss to write a screenplay for a feature film adaptation. Unfortunately, the film lingered in development hell for over a decade until Kubrick lost the rights to the story. In 1983, Kubrick reacquired the rights to Super Toys Last All Summer Long. 2 years later, in 1985, Kubrick encouraged Steven Spielberg to direct the movie, with Kubrick producing it, stating that he felt the material was much more suited to Spielberg's directorial sensibilities than his own. This is important to note, as many reports suggest that Kubrick passed the project to Spielberg in the mid-90s. But always ahead of his time, Kubrick instinctually knew back in the mid-80s that Spielberg was the man for the job. He may not have officially passed the directorial reins over to Spielberg until '95, but the idea was there a decade earlier. Still, having the most commercially successful filmmaker in history on board the project with Warner Bros. Blessing, the studio that had granted Kubrick carte blanche and final cut nearly his whole career, even considering all of that, the film still languished in development purgatory for another 4 years. In 1989, Aldiss was fired by Kubrick from his screenwriting duties over creative differences. Screenwriter Bob Shaw was subsequently hired but only lasted 6 weeks on the project, before succumbing to Kubrick's taxing work schedule. In March 1990, Kubrick hired writer Ian Watson to fill in for Aldiss. Interestingly, rather than emphasizing the material in Super Toys Last All Summer Long, Kubrick gave Watson a copy of The Adventures of Pinocchio as an inspirational blueprint, pitching AI as a Picard-esque robot version of Pinocchio. Kubrick and Spielberg also described the project to executives as Blade Runner meets Field of Dreams when they were shopping the project around to executives. As one might expect, this deeply incensed Aldiss, who publicly decried his unceremonious ouster, stating, quote, "Not only did the bastard fire me, he hired my enemy instead." British writer Sarah Maitland was also brought on to contribute to the screenplay. According to Maitland, Kubrick never referred to the project as AI. Instead, he constantly called it Pinocchio, with a deliberate effort made to give the story a feminist fairy tale focus. Weirdly enough, Kubrick always intended the movie to be simply called AI. However, after the test audiences were left baffled by the title, it was officially changed to AI: Artificial Intelligence, so that people wouldn't assume it was a film about A1 steak sauce. We wish we were kidding. In addition to Super Toys Last All Summer Long and The Adventures of Pinocchio, it's also worth noting that the story of AI also bears a loose resemblance to the 1952 manga Astro Boy by Osamu Tezuka. The classic manga involves an android boy equipped with real human emotions created by a scientist to replace his deceased son. Much like David in AI, Astro Boy is also sold to a robotic circus and forced to fight in a gladiatorial arena in front of human spectators. Oddly enough, the plot of AI also bears an eerie resemblance to William Butler Yeats' 1889 poem, The Stolen Child, in which a boy is abducted from his family by a gaggle of feral children who live in the woods and never grows old. The text of the poem appears twice in the film in such direct descriptions as,
"Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand."
Not for nothing, but others have also noticed stark similarities between AI and Philip K. Dick's 1953 short story Second Variety, which involves sentient, self-replicating robots as a plot to assassinate the Soviets ahead of nuclear war. 3 weeks after Watson was hired to write the screenplay, he turned in his first treatment in April 1990. As a tireless perfectionist, Kubrick demanded more of Watson, resulting in another year of work on the screenplay. In May 1991, Watson finished his work on the film after turning in an additional 90-page screen story. One of the biggest changes in Watson's final draft involved the character of Gigolo Joe. Originally, the character was conceived as a GI mecha. It was Watson's idea to change the character from a soldier to a male prostitute, prompting Kubrick to joke, quote, "I guess we just lost the kiddie market." As we'll get into later on, much of the darker, more adult material attributed to Kubrick in the film actually came from Watson and/or Spielberg himself. Spielberg actually took a screenplay credit for the first time since Poltergeist in 1982 due to his screenwriting contributions on AI. In fact, around this time in the early 90s, Kubrick abandoned AI and began developing a feature film entitled The Aryan Papers, an adaptation of the 1991 novel Wartime Lies by Louis Begley. According to Variety, Kubrick left AI at the time because he felt that modern-day computer animation was not yet advanced enough to create convincing AI characters like David and Teddy. Kubrick also felt that no child actor could credibly play a robot like David. However, once Kubrick saw what Spielberg and special effects legend Stan Winston had achieved in Jurassic Park with its deft mixture of CG and animatronics, he felt the technology had finally caught up with his vision for AI. As a result, in November 1993, Warner Bros. Announced that AI had officially been greenlit and production would officially commence in 1994. Speaking of Jurassic Park, it's worth noting that before Haley Joel Osment was cast as David, Jurassic Park actor Joseph Mazzello performed a screen test for Stanley Kubrick in 1994. While Kubrick initially envisioned David to be a complete CG rendering, Mazzello's screen test helped open up the idea of casting a real human in the role. That year, conceptual artist and illustrator Christopher Baker, aka Fangorn, was hired to create a wealth of storyboards. Kubrick hired Baker after seeing his first graphic novel and gave him free rein to create the entire visual aesthetic of the film, even though Baker had zero previous film experience. During pre-production, several visual effects supervisors were recruited but ultimately failed to live up to Kubrick's expectations. Believe it or not, after Kubrick saw his work on Judge Dredd, the director actively sought to hire video artist Chris Cunningham to create and supervise the robotic design of David for AI. Once he was hired, Cunningham created an army of, quote, little robot-type humans to represent David, but it didn't work. According to Kubrick's brother-in-law and longtime producing partner Jean Harlan, we tried to construct a little boy with a movable rubber face to see whether we could make it look appealing, but it was a total failure. It looked awful. After spending more than a year on the project, Cunningham left to pursue a directing career. Robotics expert Hans Morvac was also hired to work as a technical consultant on the film, but his contributions, if any, went uncredited. The same partially goes for the late great Stan Winston, who, despite receiving credit for supervising the robotic animations in the film, went uncredited for creating the special robot makeup effects. On the topic of casting, it's worth noting that even though Mazzello underwent a screen test for Kubrick, Haley Joel Osment was always Steven Spielberg's first and only choice to play the role of David, likely due to his precocious performance in The Sixth Sense. As for David's surrogate mother, Monica, played by Frances O'Connor, both Julianne Moore and Gwyneth Paltrow were considered for the role. Likewise, before Chris Rock was hired to play the AI comedian launched from a cannon at the Flesh Fair, Jerry Seinfeld was strongly considered. it's also cool to know that Spielberg passed on directing both Jurassic Park 3 and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets to make this passion project following the death of Stanley Kubrick in March 1999. He could have easily made more commercial projects, but wisely decided to follow through with Kubrick's master plan. This decision paid off quite well both critically and financially, and AI is officially dedicated to Stanley Kubrick. While Kubrick asked Spielberg to direct AI as early as 1985, the two kept going back and forth over who would officially oversee the movie for years. Even after Kubrick officially passed the project to Spielberg in 1995, Spielberg was still non-committal and sought to direct other projects, and he encouraged Kubrick to remain on board as director. When Kubrick became interested in directing Eyes Wide Shut instead, AI officially went on hold until his tragic and unforeseen demise 3 days after turning Eyes Wide Shut into Warner Brothers executives. Following Kubrick's passing, his wife Christiane personally phoned Spielberg and asked him to direct AI, stating that if he didn't direct it, the movie would never see the light of day. Understandably, Spielberg could not refuse at the time. According to Spielberg in the Creating AI Making of documentary, he and Kubrick, quote, spent 2 months going over all of his storyboards. There were almost 1,000 storyboards he had already done on the film and a 90-page treatment that he had supervised based on the short story Super Toys Last All Summer Long by Brian Aldiss, and then the screen story by Ian Watson, which Stanley had pretty much worked on with Ian. End quote. Revising the script from the 90-page treatment Ian Watson turned in for Kubrick, Spielberg became heavily invested in the project once he decided to honor his filmmaking idol. As such, he adhered to as much of Kubrick's original vision as possible. Chris Vanghorn Baker was rehired to work as a conceptual artist and continue the process he started with Kubrick, and Spielberg hired his longtime Oscar-winning cinematographer, Janusz Kaminski, to light and lens the picture. Armed with a healthy $100 million or so budget, scheduled filming on AI was set to commence in July 2000. To keep the project shrouded in secrecy, in typical Kubrick fashion, the principal actors signed $1 million non-disclosure agreement contracts before filming started. However, the contracts were eventually exposed by E! News, which ironically only heightened the buzz for this top-secret mystery project before it was officially underway. Following a month-long delay, principal photography on AI officially began on August 17, 2000. And lasted until November 18, 2000. Despite the 3-month schedule, the film was actually shot over the course of just 67 days. With the exception of a few weeks filmed on location in the forests of Oxbow Regional Park in Gresham, Oregon and Guerneville, California, the entire film was shot on various Warner Brothers sound stages on the studio's backlot in California. Some scenes were also filmed inside the geodesic Spruce Goose Dome in Long Beach, California, including the meat market sequence. For the scenes depicting future New York submerged in water due to climate change melting the polar ice caps, Spielberg repurposed the large water tank used for the Warner Brothers movie The Perfect Storm. And for the underwater ice age sequence where David is trapped for millennia, real ice was used to create the timeless otherworldly aesthetic. The grand irony of AI is that many of the sweet story elements attributed to Spielberg's family-oriented sensibilities were actually conceived by Kubrick, and likewise, many of the darker aspects of the movie often associated with Kubrick's work were conjured by Spielberg. According to a 2002 interview with Joe Layden, Spielberg claimed that the first 40 minutes of the movie and the last 20 minutes of the movie were directly lifted from Kubrick's original story. The character of Teddy, David's loving companion, was also created by Kubrick. Ian Watson has confirmed that the faux fairy tale ending of the movie that many attributed to Spielberg came from the screenplay that Watson and Kubrick collaborated on. According to Watson, quote, "The final 20 minutes are pretty close to what I wrote for Stanley, and what Stanley wanted. Faithfully filmed by Spielberg without added schmaltz." End quote. Oddly enough, the entire flesh fair sequence in the middle of the movie, which many assume came from Kubrick due to its dark depictions of humanity, was actually Spielberg's idea. The way in which the two iconic directors inverted their own style and sensibility in collaboration with one another is partially why this movie has such a transcendent magical quality that's so hard to pin down. And now is a great time to highlight the additional connections and contributions that Kubrick made to the final version of AI. Like for starters, the list of words spoken by Monica in the beginning to imprint David's love, Cyrus, Socrates, particle, decibel, hurricane, dolphin, tulip, was the original list of words that Kubrick came up with himself. Interestingly, Robin Williams recorded his voice performance for Dr. No under Kubrick's direction, not Spielberg's. Williams, who had already worked with Spielberg on Hook in 1991, also starred in Bicentennial Man in 1999 as a character who, much like David, is an AI. He's an artificial being that just wants to become human. Kubrick also contributed to the music of AI in many ways. For instance, the industrial heavy metal band Ministry, which performs during the Flesh Fair in the film, was handpicked by Kubrick. According to the lore, Kubrick heard a crew member playing Ministry's music on the set of Eyes Wide Shut and became an instant fan. Kubrick also appreciated that Ministry sampled dialogue from his classic Vietnam War movie Full Metal Jacket on a previous album. So, Kubrick personally called Ministry's lead singer, Al Jurgensen, and asked if he would like to be in the film. Figuring that it was a joke, as anyone would, Jurgensen hung up on Kubrick before ultimately agreeing to participate. The piece of classical music heard in the film as David and Gigolo Joe first arrive in Rogue City was also suggested by Kubrick during pre-production. The song is taken from Richard Strauss's comic opera Der Rosenkavalier. Although Spielberg's longtime collaborator John Williams scored AI, the Oscar-winning composer felt that Kubrick's choice of music was perfect for the scene based on the way that Spielberg shot it, and he kept it in the final version of the film, referring to the classic piece as his Kubrick homage. According to Spielberg in creating AI, the character of Gigolo Joe was also created by Kubrick, but he wasn't fleshed out, so to speak. It was Spielberg's idea to turn Gigolo Joe into a dancer that harkens back to the elegant male gigolos of the 1930s, complete with a dashing long coat and a tail. When Jude Law was cast, he immediately channeled Fred Astaire's sense of grace and charm, building on the idea that Spielberg created for the character. There are also several Kubrick trademarks and subtle homages to the director in AI. For instance, the film takes place in the years 2142 and 4142. The number 42 appears prominently in many of Kubrick's films, but especially The Shining. Another example includes Professor Hobby, played by William Hurt, which is a sly reference to Hobby Films, a production company that Kubrick set up to produce his movies in the UK, but never actually appears in the credits for his projects. Even cooler, the circular light fixture above Professor Hobby in his lab is the same apparatus used in the War Room in Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. Also, when David and Gigolo Joe first arrive on the neon-drenched Rogue City, they pass a milk bar, which is a clever nod to the Korova milk bar featured prominently in Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. The lewd pink building of a woman on all fours in Rogue City also bears a striking resemblance to the subservient female mannequin in the Korova milk bar. And perhaps most famously, when David competes with Martin in the film and he begins cramming spinach in his mouth, Henry screams,
"Down, put it down now.
Stop, David.
David, stop it."
These words are nearly taken verbatim from HAL 9000 in Kubrick's sci-fi classic 2001: A Space Odyssey, when Bowman begins disassembling the evil supercomputer.
Dave, stop.
Of course, HAL was too a form of artificial intelligence, with Kubrick warning of the potential dangers of the sentient technology dating back to the 1960s before working on AI. And not for nothing, but many have noticed a similarity in the tone of HAL's voice and the vocal tone of Teddy in AI. Coincidence? You decide.
You will break.
As for Rogue City, groundbreaking techniques were used to create the Las Vegas-inspired adult playground. For instance, Spielberg and his trailblazing effects crew pioneered the process of pre-visualization, or previs, and created a virtual studio to bring Rogue City to life. Pre-visualization allows the filmmakers to see digitally created backgrounds through playback in real time, rather than the performers interacting with a blue screen. As the very first movie to use computer-animated pre-visualization, a combination of real, practical set and a 360-degree blue screen studio were utilized to represent Rogue City. As such, the environment is loaded with intricate detail. Just as Spielberg did with CGI and animators for Jurassic Park, he and his team revolutionized the previs technique and was subsequently used by Peter Jackson for the epic, award-winning Lord of the Rings trilogy. The irony is that when Kubrick was still aboard the project as a director, he was deeply unsatisfied with the pre-visualization advancements at the time, as well as the high cost that Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, charged for them. In Rogue City, the erotic design of cars entering the city on a bridge through the mouth of a woman was created by Chris Fangorn Baker. Believe it or not, a building resembling an erect penis had to be digitally removed in order to achieve a PG-13 rating. Production designer Rick Carter expanded on Fangorn's concept and the layout of Rogue City and made sure to honor Kubrick's original storytelling wishes. In the Creating AI documentary, Carter says that, quote, "Early on in the process of developing this movie, Steven talked to me about this idea that Stanley Kubrick had told him about, which is the idea of mode jerking. So it's the idea that you go from one mode to another mode to another mode, and that was supposed to be a kind of entertainment in Rogue City when they got there. And I realized that this whole movie is like mode jerking. Once David starts on his journey, it just goes from one incredible place to another to another. So I think one of the big leaps it takes is into Rogue City, just this extravagant place of sex and debauchery." End quote. Continuing on his collaborations with Baker's illustrations, Carter added, quote, "One of the reasons why Steven wanted to make the movie was an illustration that Chris Baker did of the entrance of Rogue City, where the bridge takes them right through the mouths into the city. And then Chris had done a number of wonderful sketches of types of buildings that might be in a place like Rogue City. So what I did was take those and say, well, if I was in Rogue City, where would those buildings be? What would be the layout that could actually allow us to see those types of views? And from there, it collaged into a geographical space that we could actually understand. And this was the way it looked in terms of the color and illustrations we did. And then with ILM, they would actually put that into their computer and make a model. We only had one half of the boulevard, for instance, and then off the boulevard is this place that we designed to a stage." End quote. Of course, one can't talk about AI without mentioning the stunning robotic work by legendary makeup and effects artist Stan Winston. According to Winston, AI was by far the most ambitious movie he'd ever worked on from a technological standpoint. And that's quite a statement for a guy who created the Terminator and the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. When Winston was approached to work on AI, Spielberg told him that the robots would not look anything like he'd worked on before, stating, quote, "It was important to Steven that the robots in AI have absolutely nothing to do with the Terminator or any of the robots we had done previously." End quote. Winston also stated, "The mechas of AI, artificial intelligence, were unlike anything audiences had seen before," adding, "Our robots range from mechanical robots to makeup designs that we created for actors wearing heavy prosthetics." Because each robot in the movie was different, a combination of live-action puppetry and traditional makeup and practical and CGI hybrid approaches were used to create characters on an individual basis. For example, the robot gardener was 100% animatronic and devoid of any human element. The more human a robotic character in the film, the more practical the effects and makeup were, and vice versa. All told, the film incorporated, quote, fully animatronic puppets, cable puppets, rod puppets, hydraulic puppets, all radio controlled and rod puppeteered, end quote, per effects supervisor J. Allen Scott. One thing fans may not realize is that the insecurity guard robot seen inside the cage at the Flesh Fair was patterned after Stan Winston himself. According to effects crew member Eric Fiedler, who says, quote, "The insecurity guard was primarily a kinetic rod puppet where all of the joints articulated like normal human joints. It had a cable rod neck, the head was silicone, the armature for the body was aluminum rods, bearings, torsion springs, all nicely machined." For the Flesh Fair sequence, a total of 46 puppeteers and technicians were required to operate all of the robots and have them perform on camera at once. According to J. Allen Scott, it was a massive undertaking to get them all up and running and performing to camera all in the same shot. Many of the actors performing as robots during the Meek market were real-life amputees. Of course, the most unsung character in AI is Teddy, the AI stuffed toy animal who actually gives David the unconditional love he seeks from his mother but never has it reciprocated. Teddy was also the most ambitious robot character created in the movie. According to Winston, designing Teddy was a huge job, due to how much screen time the character has. Winston claims that Teddy is a more complex animatronic robot than any dinosaur featured in Jurassic Park, stating the following: "We'd given our Velociraptor 34 points of motion and our T-Rex 40 points of motion, but Teddy had 50 points of motion, all in a little character that was less than 3 feet tall. He had to act, he had to talk, he had to deliver a varied and convincing performance. We had to create the ultimate robotic teddy bear, and that was the biggest, most difficult job we'd ever taken on." Jack Angel, the actor who had provided the voice of Teddy in the film, after recording his performance in the sound booth, stayed on set for 3.5 months and was on hand to re-record the dialogue on the spot if seen fit. The puppeteers worked in unison with Angel to properly adjust Teddy's expressions based on the new dialogue created in any given scene, giving Spielberg tremendous freedom to make Teddy just right. According to Winston, "We knew going in that we weren't going to be able to do everything Teddy does with a live teddy bear. Again, it was going to be this hopefully seamless blend between live action and the CG world. From a live action standpoint, we wanted to do as much as we possibly could do." As revealed in creating AI, there were 6 puppeteers to perform Teddy, for the arms, the head, the body, the legs, the facial features. Paddles were used to control Teddy's lips when he speaks, which allowed the character to speak faster than if using typical wires. Under Winston's supervision, Teddy's robot had a series of expression heads that would range from his hero head, which within itself would reach many ranges of expressions because there were 24 servos operating that little head. Then we had a happy head, which had a broader smile. We had a sad head. We had a concerned head. We had a curmudgeon face. We had various expression heads, and each of them was interchangeable with the hero body. Then we also had a self-contained Teddy that would be carried around and also had a limited amount of performance movement, body movement, and arm movement. And Haley Joel could carry the Teddy around with him.
Teddy literally worked every day of a 67-day shooting schedule.
Speaking of Haley Joel, it was his idea for David to never blink in the movie until the end when he becomes a real boy, after suggesting the idea to Spielberg as a way to reinforce David's artificiality. The director agreed it was a good idea and suggested that all of the mechas should avoid blinking in the movie. However, other than David, several mechas do blink in the film. To accentuate David's plastic robot look, the hair on his arms, face, and body were shaved daily and a synthetic was applied to his skin to give him a waxy sheen. Osment's father, Eugene, also appears in the film as Super Nerd and was instrumental in helping Haley Joel shape his performance on set. In between takes, Haley Joel spent 3 hours per day studying school subjects on the set to make up for his missed class time. While a whole video could be dedicated to how sad the ending of the movie really is, particularly regarding the abandonment of Teddy by David to live a tragically misguided eternal wish fulfillment, it's probably best to end with a cautionary quote from Spielberg himself. After all, it's no surprise that AI received critical praise and opened at first place in the box office in June 2001, or that the film went on to gross roughly $236 million worldwide. That's what Spielberg does, deliver blockbuster entertainment to the masses. What is surprising is how advanced AI technology has become in the past 2 decades since the film's release. Not to mention the devastating effects of climate change also brilliantly portrayed in the film. As such, let's end with the cautionary wisdom of Steven Spielberg, who believes that this is what the fuck could happen to AI artificial intelligence. I think that we have to be very careful about how we as a species use our genius, because we are an amazing species, the human race. And every year we create things that 2 years before would have appeared like magic to most people. And suddenly it's reality, and a few years later it's commonplace in our homes. Like the internet. I just think that we all have to be careful as we quantumly leap ahead into the future that we create for ourselves. You know? To take responsibility for the things we put on this planet. and also to take responsibility for the things we take off the planet.